You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We've got our first guest on today, Dan Holler, who's the Communications Director at Heritage Action. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you back with us on the Final Say Radio Show. How are you? Let me get him. Hey, Dan, how are you?
Hey, doing well, guys. How are you doing?
Well, you know, we're frustrated. We've been discussing heavily foreign policy, as I mentioned to you, all week. We've been really wanting to get the issue that you're going to discuss with us. So thank God you reached out with some good, interesting storylines. And what we're going to get into made me think of something. It's the unintended consequences, Dan, that we don't think of when people are either calling for some sort of congressional action or calling for their local politicians to react to some sort of an incident. In this case, around this country, we saw what happened in Colorado, we saw what happened in Connecticut, and then we say, well, we have to do something about guns. And that's why we have you on, Dan. And you've carefully thought of a few things here, and I'd like you to introduce that to our audience.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right about the unintended consequences, and I don't know how many people have read through this Senate gun bill that's going to be brought up next week, but President Obama, urged all of us to go ahead and read it, so I took him up on the challenge. And when you go through and read it, you realize it criminalizes some pretty commonplace behavior, and you get the feeling that the people who wrote this legislation don't know anything about guns. They don't know anybody who owns guns. They probably never even held a gun. I mean, that's sort of the type of people who wrote this, because it's something as simple as going to your neighbor and saying, hey buddy, I'm going to the shooting range. Do you mind if I borrow your handgun? A lot of us do that all the time. It's not a big deal. And if you were to do that and the Senate bill were to be law, you'd be committing a felony unless you went through a criminal background check. So, I mean, that's sort of the scope that we're talking about here, that this universal background check provision has.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think there are enough gun laws around this country. I think we could actually eliminate some of them or merge some of them together and have something that's a little more coherent and speed up the process for honest, good-to-do citizens to be able to, get qualified immediately and be able to go purchase their gun or their ammo and go enjoy whatever, because you have a right. You can go enjoy whatever it is that you'd like to do, whether it's hunting or shooting or sportsmanship or having them on display in your house. But, Dan, let me just bring up something. Recently, John and I were out in California. We had a nice visit with one of our cousins, and we went to a gun range. So had we just borrowed his guns and went to the gun range, we could be subject to 5 years in prison.
Right, and because it was your cousin, not a parent, not a sibling, not a grandparent, you're not allowed to do that transfer under this Leahy-Schumer-Reed bill. So, right, you guys would have been committing a felony, and he would have been committing a felony by letting you take it away from him to, temporarily go use it at a shooting range. I mean, that's how this law is constructed, and it's fascinating. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people go hunting, that are listening to your show, and if you've ever borrowed a friend's hunting rifle, going on a big trip, didn't need to take an extra rifle, you can't do that either unless you go through a background check under this bill. I mean, again, that's sort of how they're trying to crack down on this common behavior that's among legal and law-abiding gun owners and users do all the time. And you get the sense that the people who are writing these laws have no clue what they're talking about.
Well, here's the question I have, Dan. How does this address the problem of having gang members, drug dealers, people who don't follow the law to begin with, those who perpetrate the horrific crimes? How does this stop them? They're going to murder. People who murder aren't good people to begin with. You think they're going to follow the law because you say you have to have a background check?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's sort of silly because, if you and I are friends and, I know that you're a criminal or mentally ill and I give you a gun, that's already illegal. I can't do that because I know that you're a criminal or you're mentally ill, right? So you can't do that already. The fact that I went ahead and gave it to you, I would probably do it even if this law passes. So, it's a great example of how what is going on within the bill doesn't actually address the problems that we're going to, or that they say they're trying to address. Really, it's about, narrowing the behavior amongst gun owners who are law-abiding, gun users that are law-abiding, and creating a stigma attached to guns. Because this is what the left does really well, is that they understand how the culture plays out over decades. And I think if they can start stigmatizing guns now, in the next generation or the next decade, they're going to be able to come back for another bite at gun laws and further restrict gun usage and go on and on and on. That's why they're so afraid of concealed carry laws, because when young adults, children, etc., communities see people exercising their gun rights responsibly, they say, oh, you know what, this isn't so bad, right? That's the last thing the left wants. They don't want a culture that accepts guns. They want a culture that is scared of guns.
Well, the frustration here, Dan, is we're seeing the proverbial boiled frog, right? And there's no getting around that we suffer from both an ill-informed society, and we also suffer from a myopic society which doesn't seem to have a problem with other people's rights disappearing, but might be very vocal. I mean, look at the irony. The same people who freak out about any restrictions on drugs, even some of which are very hardcore and proven to be extremely dangerous, right? Because a gun by its very nature doesn't generate a psychotic episode, but if you're holding it in your hand. But there's a lot of drugs that people would like to make legal. The same people who are trying to take guns out of your hands are mostly the same group who wants to make drugs fully legal. And those are the exact types of things that make turn a car into a killing machine. 6 beers turns a car into a killing machine. Anyway, so we really need to take back more control from this. But again, I worry that we live in a society that is so easily emotionally led around, like one of those bulls with the metal ring in his nose. And we need folks like the Heritage Action, you and all your colleagues to keep screaming this from the mountaintops. It's so hard to get our rights back once we lose them. People fought and died for those rights.
They did, and the media is not doing people any favors either, because they're going around using tremendously out-of-date statistics and talking about guns. I mean, you hear this, 40% of all gun purchases happen without a background check. That's thrown around a lot. That's from the pre-Brady bill, which was the 1993 gun bill. Those stats came from before that time, so we're talking 2 decades old stats there. There's another one thrown about that's 80% of all criminals who committed a crime with a gun got their guns, through some other source, not a background check, friends, family, etc. Well, that stat is also almost 2 decades old, and it's false on the face, because you're talking about people who go on and buy it illegally on the street, get it from a family member, which would still be allowed. So there are a bunch of stats flowing around out there that shouldn't be trusted, but nobody in the media goes through the effort of fact-checking.
Dan, that's a great point. Just look around you with other things, such as people who drink and drive and they lose their license, or people who aren't supposed to be in this country who drive cars, or people who don't have a license and drive cars, whether they're drinking or not. And these people get pulled over, and they still do it. I mean, I know people from the area who have probably been pulled over for drunk driving, 3 or 4 times. I know someone who's even done jail time, and they still do it. And so those are the people you want to focus on, not the people like you and I who are obeying the laws and respecting the laws and acting responsibly. I just don't agree with any of these assaults upon the Second Amendment.
And if you go back and look at what happened with the 1993 bill, and you look at this, there's these, the Department of Justice has these stats about, crimes committed with a gun. And, the number of people who committed crimes with a gun, that percentage actually rose after the 1993 gun bill. So, it's one data point, but it's a data point that shows, hey, look, you can do whatever you want on gun control, but the fact is that, it's not going to do anything to deter the criminals. They're going to figure it out.
Right. Well, first off, let's go back. You brought up the Brady bill, right? I actually resaw that video clip just this past week, not actually related to the gun control issue. And that was a mental health issue. One of the things you see, and I'm all for regulations that seriously, help to keep the same as I want to keep 90-year-old people who are 80% blind from driving cars. That doesn't mean we're not empathetic, that doesn't, but it means they're not necessarily safe behind a wheel. But that's not a wholesale restriction, and I don't necessarily consider that abridging the rights. one of the things, Dan, that really irks me is you hear all this talk about, well, the gun is uniquely different because they're because of the instantaneous nature of how people use it. That may be true when somebody catches his wife or her husband in bed with the neighbor, but in almost all cases, when we look at these sociopaths, don't we end up finding a long tail, a whole trail of information, the pictures on their wall, the notes they sent, the diatribe and the lunacy? These aren't sudden acts of passion. These are seem to be slow boiling psychotic events that are probably very predictable if you take a mental health approach instead of bridging the rights of the average American who just wants to respect the Constitution and doesn't, quite frankly, owe anybody an explanation. That's the other thing. I don't, and you don't, Dan, owe anybody an explanation why, nor should we have to prove that we feel a need to have that gun. It's unabridged unless there's a real serious reason like mental health or you're a felon for not having one.
Yeah, that's a great point. And sadly, if you look back at some of the more recent tragedies, you can go through and finally people are starting to see, there was a really clear line of evidence that there was a huge problem going on with this individual. And there were warning signs, and there was nothing done about it. And this is why Heritage has argued, and I think very persuasively, that the best solutions lie at the local level. They lie within families. They lie within local communities, right? I mean, that's where you're going to pick up these telltale signs. The bureaucrats in Washington aren't going to be able to figure this out. It's the families and local communities that are really the first and most effective and perhaps only line of defense against this sort of stuff.
Well, and we also see very clearly just by the, and I don't want to overplay what could have been just a stupid slip of the lip, but here you have this congresswoman just this week, right, who doesn't know the first thing about a gun, but somehow she's going to lecture us on guns, right? She probably doesn't even know which direction to point the gun in, clearly. And it just shouldn't be her role. But I have a bigger issue to me, which is we have a need for gun control. But the need for gun control is on our border. The need for gun control is in and around gangs, gang violence, among criminals. I mean, this thing where we continue to focus on trying to make criminals of the innocent instead of really focusing where we need to be. If the president came out and said, look, I know it's a tight financial crunch, but, I'm tired of seeing, young kids. I mean, look, two beautiful young black children in very close proximity to the celebrations around his election were shot cold, if you recall, in Chicago, right? Both look like drive-by kind of shootings. And if he had come out and said, this has to stop, and I'm going to find money, I'm going to spend money to help rid us of gang violence, things like that, you know what? I'd pat him on the back. I'd be the first one to line up behind him. But it's all distraction. It's all BS, because at the end of the day, he's not trying to make us safer. It's all about politicizing and stealing my rights to buy votes. To me, is unacceptable, and I hold him in contempt for it.
It's interesting. I was reading through one of these old statistic reports from the Department of Justice, and they lumped in, military-style assault weapons that were semi-automatic with fully automatic weapons. They made no distinction in the report between the two. So, I mean, this is a huge problem, right? Because you have the function of these two firearms are completely different. They operate in a totally different and distinct manner. And yet, in the eyes of the Department of Justice, there was no discernible difference between the two. They felt compelled to lump them together in the same report. So you have this huge problem where you have folks in Washington who are disconnected from reality. What they know about guns is what they see in movies and TV shows and, from, sort of the left-wing media that you get inundated with here in Washington. That's their knowledge base about firearms, and that's how they approach this stuff, and that's what guides them when they're making laws and crafting regulations, and it's a huge problem for the rest of the country, especially law-abiding gun owners and gun users.
That's a great point, Dan, because statistics could say whatever you want them to, but let me ask you this. If we outlawed guns tomorrow, does that mean the Secret Service is going to stop investigating and researching in an area and putting up a security apparatus every time the president goes somewhere?
Right. I mean, I don't think anybody seriously expects what's being discussed to make
work.
a dent. Right. I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, look at all these policies that are being rammed through, specifically at the state level. These have been goals of the left for a long, long time. And if you look through the policies and what they're going to do, you realize it wouldn't have prevented, sadly, any of the tragedies that have happened. And you start to realize that you're right, this is being politicized, and they're trying to use a Rahm Emanuel phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to capitalize on the political moment. And sadly, some states, including my home state of Maryland, are going along with it.
Here's a great example of something that's happening in New York. They just arrested a whole handful of New York Senate members and other politicians for various forms of corruption. Bribery and things of that nature, and I'm sure you've seen the stories. But then you see other politicians in New York and New Jersey coming out now saying, we can't accept this kind of behavior, and so on, like taking advantage of the political moment to make sure that they're the ones out there in the news cycle saying, oh, we can't stand for this.
Yeah,
it's all political opportunity.
The whole debate has been morphed, and it's really hard, especially for people who are genuinely concerned with the policy stuff coming out. How to understand what is going on, and it's a shame. And we have a lot of work ahead of us if we're going to sort through it all.
That's right, we sure do. Well, Dan, thank you as always for joining us here on the Final Say Radio Show, and keep up the great work. And please give us your website so all of our listeners could check it out.
It's heritageaction.com. Nice and simple.
Great. Dan, have a wonderful weekend.
Hey, thanks. You guys too.
All right, take care. That was Dan Holler, Communications Director with Heritage Action for America. Great stuff as always.